The bells did not ring for miracles here. They rang for fire, for flood, for the small catastrophes that turned neighbors into search parties and mothers into prayers. On the night the wind tasted of iron and the lantern glass sang with frost, a sickness slipped between doors like a practiced thief, and the village held its breath, as if stillness might bribe the dark. In the square, a figure laid hands upon a child while whispers pooled like water in ruined mortar. Each breath a wager, each heartbeat an argument against despair. The air smelled of thyme and rain-damp wool, the sky a low bruise, and somewhere a crow spoke the single syllable that always sounds like no de. The touch that soothed others had begun to sting the one who carried it. Beneath the calm, something bright and brittle crept along the edges of endurance, yet the hands did not falter. When the child's rattling eased, relief rushed out in a hush so complete the night could hear its own echo, and the price quietly raised its head. Morning came as if poured from a pewter cup, the sky a matte lid, the square rinsed clean of night and its small astonishments. Word of the child's recovery ran ahead of footsteps, weaving through shutters and across bread lines, turning hunger into stories and stories into a kind of hunger all their own. In the apothecary, shelves muttered with glass and herb, and advice grew sharp as thorns. Rest, ration, relent. But the measure of a life had never seemed to balance with the measure of a single body, and the argument between mercy and survival resumed its old duet. Outside, boots approached with the crisp certainty of orders, and a shadow crossed the counter like a sundial. A seal glinted crimson on parchment, a promise dressed as a plea. The room felt suddenly narrower, as if the world had shifted its chair closer. Somewhere, bells rehearsed a royal cadence no one had requested. The seal broke with the sound of a dry leaf. Words unfolded like a map of someone else's desperation. A child with a crown and a cough, a city stitched shut by mourning cloth, a queen who measured hope in decrees. The room's silence thickened as duty and dread braided themselves into a single cord and pulled. The road to the capital ran through rain and rumor, through shrines that remembered more than they forgave. A journey meant more hands to help, but also more chances to spend what could not be replenished. The one who carried the remedy tasted iron again, as if the body had learned the language of cost and now spoke it fluently. The messenger's gaze held questions shaped like warnings, and the old teacher's eyes held answers shaped like grief. Outside, the square brightened with a pallid sun as if pretending courage. The parchment lay between them like a hinge, and the day tilted. Arguments dressed themselves as care. Sleep more, heal less, choose wisely. And care disguised itself as arguments, if not you. Who, if not now, when? The road called with its usual indifference, promising mud, fog, and the blunt arithmetic of triage. Trust was tender here, a skittish animal. It stepped close, then flinched. The one assigned to guard spoke of oaths and roots and contingencies. The one who mixed tinctures spoke of numbers and the end of numbers. The one who bore the touch listened with a stillness that was not surrender, only attention. Behind their words, a quieter voice threaded through, the knowledge that every mercy performed on the road would lay another stone on the scale inside a single chest. Outside, clouds gathered like a council. A choice materialized not as a blaze, but as a path simply not taken yet. Departure, when it finally happens, seldom looks like trumpets. It looks like lists checked twice, like bread wrapped in cloth, like doors held a moment too long. The village watched without gathering, each window a small theater of blessing and fear. A cart creaked forward. Boots found the rhythm of leaving. Promises were exchanged that no one believed. Write when you can. Be careful. Don't spend yourself all at once. Yet their saying was the ritual that made moving possible. The road received them with wet leaves and the smell of loam. A small wind lifted, turning the day's face toward distance. The one who could soothe others felt the familiar sting beneath the skin, and did not name it. The work ahead would have many names. When the valley finally folded behind them, the bells did ring. Not for miracles, but for the hour. And that, too, felt like a blessing. The road began as a ribbon of patience, damp with old rain and strewn with black feathers that shone like spilled ink. Crows watched from hedgerows as if counting, and mile markers rose from the mud like teeth worn by many winters. The first to need help came as they always did, without ceremony, only the embarrassed gravity of pain. But mercy drew other footsteps like a bell draws dusk. Each stopped breath, steadied, became a weight hung on an invisible hook inside a single chest, and the hook bent with the arithmetic of kindness. A companion kept pace with a ledger maker's mind, measuring not worth, but endurance, asking whether every small salvation must be bought with a larger loss. Between villages, the clouds pressed low enough to smudge voices, and the wells beside the road muttered like sleepwalkers. Even the cart seemed to listen, creaking in a key reserved for warnings. When a cart wheel cracked and a man fell, choice arrived again, plain as earth. The wells along the Queen's Road were reputed to remember names. If you leaned close, the echo gave you back the syllables you'd broken somewhere. At noon they stopped for water, and the stone throat below repeated a sound that did not belong to thirst. A woman collapsed by the trough with a fever that smelled of metal and orchard rot. The body that knew how to answer reached forward on instinct, and the cost flared bright as the strike of flint. A hand caught that wrist, not as command but as plea. The ledger could not hold another entry without forethought. The fevered breath rasped, then steadied under cloth soaked in cool water, and patience performed a smaller, slower miracle that no one would sing about. Above, crows changed trees, black scratches on a page turning itself. The day elongated into a hush between storms. Somewhere ahead, a crossroads waited with its signposts and its preferred price for news. Night pitched its tent early, the fog a canvas stretched tight between trees. They camped beneath an old shrine cut from a single boulder, its face worn smooth by the weather's unrecorded prayers. Firelight licked the edges of maps and the rims of tin cups, and the air smelled of resin and damp wool. The debate that had shadowed their steps took a chair by the flames, whether goodness could survive being poured endlessly from one vessel, whether restraint could be a kind of courage rather than a failure of nerve. In the quiet between sentences, the ache beneath a sleeve gnawed like a patient animal. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a fox arranged the night with small feet. Somewhere farther still, a larger listener turned its head. Rain began without drama, only the kindness of sound. They took notes not on paper, but on resolve, inventing rules the road would later try to break. The crossroads arrived like a judgment. 4 pale roads splayed from a gallows-straight signpost, and the wind carried the sweet-sour scent of apples rotting unseen. She waited there, wrapped in mourning that looked more like uniform than grief, eyes steady, as if she had never learned to blink. The air around her held a stillness that did not belong to weather. She spoke without raising her voice, and the facts laid themselves out like clean instruments. Debts equaled breaths, ledgers balanced themselves, and inheritance ran, not only through blood, but through promises spoken by the desperate. The words were not cruel, but neither were they soft, and the world behind them felt crowded with closed doors. A memory surfaced of a night long ago when a different mouth had offered a miracle like a candle, lovely, insufficient, hungry. The signpost creaked. Somewhere a crow scolded the wind for thinking itself important. After the meeting, silence walked with them a while, a third presence neither hostile nor kind. The rules they had drafted by firelight felt both heavier and more necessary, like armor that pinched but turned blades. When they passed a hamlet where coughing burned behind shutters, the pull was nearly tidal. Yet they moved on, trading urgency for instruction. How to boil water, when to air linens, where to lay fevered bodies so wind could comb their breath. The ache beneath a sleeve receded to a tolerable spark, not victory but reprieve. By dusk the fog thinned, revealing a knife slice of horizon the color of old copper. In that line was something like promise, not that suffering would end, but that choices might become a craft rather than a crisis. The road did not praise or punish. It simply received their weight, and the cartwheels found a rhythm that sounded almost like patience. The city revealed itself like a bruise under gauze, streets swaddled in funeral cloth, windows painted with soot to keep out what had already gotten in. At the gate, a tally board ticked in chalk beside a basket of wilted rosemary, and the guards wore their worry like another piece of armor. Bells did not ring here. They exhaled, hollow and apologetic, as if tired of carrying the weight of notice. The road's rumors ripened into fact with the first cough that threaded the air, small and knife-bright. A decree posted at the arch promised nothing but order, and even that wavered in the wind. They passed through as if stepping into a church where the god had left, voices lowered, movements careful, each glance a petition. Within the walls, the avenues folded toward a palace that seemed both fortress and plea. Somewhere inside, a heartbeat small enough to fit in a teacup railed against a story larger than itself, and the city held the note. The throne room did not glitter. It absorbed light, all velvet and stone, and the hush of a place where decisions have long memories. The woman who ruled seemed less a crown than a question. What would you pay to keep one life from the arithmetic of loss? She spoke as if every syllable had been weighed against consequence, laying out the shape of a calamity that sought a crib and spared a dynasty, then ricocheted through alleys and bred lines. The tale was a mirror held at an angle, catching old bargains in its edge. A promise made at a shrine for the safety of a child, a debt that found its payment elsewhere. The air tasted of citrus oil and worry. Somewhere beyond the drapes, a small cough stitched itself into the tapestry of sound. Mercy and policy looked at one another across a table and could not decide which owed the other an apology. The palace kept its secrets in satin-wrapped drawers, and in the margins of letters where someone had pressed too hard with a pen. In a side chamber trimmed with quiet, a stack of correspondence waited like a patient animal. The envelopes wore a familiar hand, the script steady the way a person becomes after shattering once. Ink told the story that air had not. The old pact stitched into a family's history. The bargain cut clean and clever. The clause that bartered a life for a lifetime of healing borrowed from elsewhere. The words laid out a lineage of mercy that looked like inheritance until you counted the missing faces in every village where gratitude had flourished. The room cooled as understanding assembled itself. The floorboards learned a new sound from a body that swayed but did not fall. By the time the last page lay open, the shape of the truth fit perfectly inside the day's quiet, because it had been there all along. Naming a truth out loud does not change its temperature, but it changes the air around it. The admission arrived like a tide that had been dragging all day, finally collapsing onto shore. The miracle and its cost were not strangers but twins in the same cradle. To heal was to withdraw against a debt that never forgot the first coin. Anger flared, then gentled, not against those who had made the bargain in love, but against the myth that called any one body inexhaustible. The question sharpened. What does care look like when it refuses to devour its giver? The room became a narrow bridge between past and future, and each breath was a step taken deliberately, without the permission of fear. Outside, the city groaned under the hour. Inside, a vow formed that did not sound like grand renunciation, but like a craftsperson selecting tools and setting limits. The beginning of a new grammar for mercy. The nursery was not grand. It was a room where a small bed tried to be a boat. A hush older than royalty braided with the sound of someone breathing too shallowly. Instruction replaced miracle for a time. Windows cracked to invite honest air. Linens boiled. Hands washed as if rehearsal could become a kind of spell. The body, that could have answered with touch, withheld that reply and reached for other languages. Tincture, timing, patience, the stubborn art of staying. The choice did not feel noble. It felt like holding a door against a wind that had spent years learning their names. The city beyond the curtains kept counting its losses, yet somewhere the arithmetic shifted by a fraction when a cough lengthened into sleep instead of silence. In that fraction lived a proposition: that a single pair of hands could teach many, and that the ledger might be balanced not by sacrifice but by multiplication. Morning thinned to a color without a name, and the day opened like a ledger already half filled. They sought answers in places that remembered different kinds of silence: a chapel with its paint rubbed to ghosts, a shrine whose stone mouth drank rain without complaint, a courtyard where ivy wrote its patient scripture up the walls. The pattern emerged not as revelation but as repetition. The same motif of mercy braided to cost, the same knot tied anew in different hands. A question followed them like weather: whether salvation borrowed at interest could ever be repaid by intention alone. The body that had learned to speak in aches kept its commentary measured, insistent. The companion who counted risks began to count breaths instead, as if numbers might become a shelter. When a hidden alcove gave up a scrap of vellum that named a debt by another name, the truth felt less like discovery than like being recognized by a mirror you had avoided. As daylight failed, the city's other economy woke. Stalls lit like constellations under patched canvas, scales that weighed more than coin, words priced according to courage. Here, debts were measured in verbs: guard, carry, teach, and in the hush that follows a promise accepted. They moved through the aisles as students of consequence, letting knowledge find them by the invitations it extended and withheld. A vendor spoke of ledgers bound in skin. An archivist offered maps to shrines that had outlived the gods who leased them. The air smelled of tannin and smoke, and the faint sweetness of bruised fruit. Instruction replaced wonder as their native tongue. They practiced saying no without apology, and yes without bravado. The ache beneath a sleeve sparked and cooled like a coal being taught patience by ash. When the wind shifted and the crowd's music broke into warning, they understood that learning also means leaving before the lesson becomes a trap. Rain braided itself into the hour until the city wore one constant sheen. On a parapet above the courtyards, confession arrived without ornament, a story told as plainly as a weather report. One life not saved when it mattered, the sound of a name becoming an echo, the years spent building a fortress. Out of competence to wall that echo in, the listener did not offer absolution, only a witness that did not flinch. In that exchange, the road's arithmetic shifted. Restraint ceased to be denial and became a craft, a way to keep a candle from devouring its own wick. Below, the city's lanterns stitched a trembling seam through fog. Above, the clouds admitted a lighter shade, not mercy, not yet, but a color that did not punish the eyes. The hurt under a sleeve quieted, not cured, only companion. Some promises are a kind of architecture. They built one and stepped inside. The message reached them as panic always does. Too fast, wearing someone else's footsteps. A familiar voice broke the careful cadence of their evening with a plea that tugged at every unhealed seam. Blood is a map few can refuse to read. They followed it through alleys that smelled of metal and bread and the thin sour of fear. When they found the fallen, choice took its place without ceremony. The art they had rehearsed, cloth, pressure, air, went to work, and the body that had once solved everything by touch learned to be a different instrument, steady, stubborn, enough. The urge to spend the old coins sparked bright. Discipline answered with both hands. The hour lasted 3, then 5 heartbeats too long before it gave. When the chest rose cleanly and color crept back, relief arrived not like a trumpet, but like a chair offered to a shaking friend. The cost remained, waiting, but they had not paid with the one currency that could not be replaced. After the crisis loosened its grip, words returned with edges. Gratitude and anger wore the same face for a while. each arguing that love must either spend itself or refuse to be loved. The room's smallness made every conviction sound larger than intended. In the quiet between sentences, the body that had chosen restraint trembled with the effort of not betraying itself to habit. The companions made their own negotiations with fear, each counting different losses. Outside, the rain gave up and the city exhaled, a long, weary note. Inside, the shape of a new vow clarified. Not martyrdom, not retreat, but apprenticeship to limits, teaching many hands, naming clear rules, refusing to let a miracle become a machine. It felt like placing stones in a river to make a crossing that would take time and patience to trust. When they finally parted for rest, nothing was solved and everything had changed in the way a compass needle changes the whole map. The palace breathed like a creature cornered, corridors drawing in cold air, chambers exhaling warmed fear. Rumor arrived ahead of footsteps. A weaver with no loom had been seen in mirrors. A coin had spun so long it learned to hum. The night market's whispers congealed into direction. The meeting place was not a hall, but a threshold, an old servant's arch where drafts carried kitchen smoke and prayer ash. There the world felt thin, and choice wore a human voice that had not yet spoken. Between them, restraint and urgency fenced the way music does, with feints and echoes. The one who had learned to ration mercy felt the familiar burn wake under her skin, impatient as a struck match. Somewhere above, a baby's cry braided with the city's long ache, and the sound went to work on every vow they'd made. When the air finally turned colder by a breath, it was not weather. It was a rival choosing its shape. He stepped from the seam where shadow meets stone, the way a word steps from breath. Politeness arrived first, immaculate and faintly amused, then accuracy. The kind that makes kindness unnecessary. He named the ledger without looking, and the room recognized its bookkeeper. Every debt had a timestamp. Every miracle accrued a kind of weather that gathered in one body until it could no longer be called weather. The offers uncoiled like ribbons cut from the same cloth. Carry the plague yourself, and the realm will sing you into silver. Return every borrowed breath, and let the city learn grieving all at once. Or sever the story at its root, and lose not only what you can do, but the chorus that has been your shelter and your chain. Silence tallied the cost of each. The one who could mend others felt her breath scale the inside of her ribs like a ladder, rung by rung, until it touched a childhood memory of a name promised to darkness and returned. Royal footsteps broke the geometry of fear, bringing with them the perfume of orange and steel. A mother entered who had learned to make decrees from inside a vigil and to beg without changing her posture. She spoke of the nursery's small breaths, the way the city's coughs braided to a requiem that dared the palace to pretend safety. Between power and plea stretched a thin wire that hummed with politics, faith, and the arithmetic of crowds. If the first offer promised a sainted ruin and the second demanded a massacre, the third was a knife that cut through story itself. What would it mean to unmake the altar that everyone had learned to bring candles to? The question slid like a key into locks old as the shrines. In the pause after, the body that could end the night with a touch did not move. She listened for the truth beneath everyone's wanting, and in that layer, something quiet as daylight said, "Choose the door that makes more doors." The spirit unscrolled the third path with a craftsman's patience. To sever the pact at origin, the first breath borrowed must be returned to the world intact. That breath, taken at a forest shrine on a winter night, had worn 1,000 masks since, each healing a performance of that first theft. To give it back would require unmaking the altar on which the story had been fed, accepting an ordinariness that felt like exile, and consenting to the erasure of the gratitude that had scaffolded a life. The terms were clear as arithmetic and slippery as grief. The companion beside her breathed, like someone relearning the instrument of lungs. The teacher's silence ripened into a hard, dark fruit. Somewhere, rain rehearsed against the palace eaves. The choice tilted the room. Become a holy wound, unleash a tidal loss, or step off the stage and teach others to build it differently. She let the tilt hold until it became balance. Decision sounded nothing like a trumpet. It arrived as a breath taken all the way down, then given back. She spoke softly, choosing the path that asked her to live without the story that had dressed her in shining debt. The words re-threaded the room. Power moved to different chairs. To return the first breath, she would have to cross the city alive with panic, slip past omens, and stand where winter had once bartered with blood. She asked for help not as command but as invitation, and hands answered. One with maps, one with steel, one with a prayer that was really a promise to keep pace. The spirit inclined his head, satisfied not by agreement but by the integrity of the sum. The hour thickened. Somewhere the nursery coughed, and then subsided into sleep, as if time granted a narrow corridor. They stepped toward it together, carrying not certainty, but craft. And that felt like the beginning of cure. Alarm does not shout in a palace. It tightens. Doors hush open. Boots learn to run without sound. And a corridor becomes a throat swallowing orders. The city's cough presses inward until it finds the cradle, and fear acquires a shape with ribbons and a tiny gold button. What had been restraint becomes direction. Not a refusal to spend, but a choice about currency. The promise made in the archway ripens under pressure. Maps shed their civility and turn into weather. The one who once answered everything with touch steadies the ache and chooses the older craft, motion. A companion gathers root and steel. A teacher gathers lists for those who will remain. Between them passes the ordinary, irreplaceable miracle of trust, which looks nothing like light and everything like not being alone. When the nursery door closes behind them, it is not abandonment, it is an equation solved for many, instead of one. The storm outside accepts the point and begins. The city unspools in gray ribbons, its alleys breathing steam and rumor. Streets tilt under the weight of argument, between miracle and method, between the impulse to reach and the discipline to teach. The cart stays behind with lists and boiling kettles. The road ahead accepts only what can be carried in lung and vow. Riot is not always fire. Sometimes it is the friction of panic against patience, the way shutters slam like punctuation. They move as a sentence that will not be shortened, past a breadline turned choir, past a shutter marking a home where air has been taught to move. Rain makes the maps blur, but not the direction. A gate that welcomed with sorrow now warns with speed, and the sky breaks into a clean, merciless percussion. The oath they carry is simple and specific. Return to the root and undo the shape of scarcity. The city, busy surviving, lets them go without permission. The crossroads finds them the way a memory finds a weakness, without effort, exactly on time. Fog climbs the signpost and wears it like a borrowed spine. She waits with the stillness of a ledger closed but not balanced. A presence built of obligation rather than malice. Words arrive measured, each the weight of a coin. Turn back. Debt collects itself. Mercy must observe its own rules. They answer not with defiance, but with the new grammar they have learned. Limits spoken aloud, a refusal to mint redemption by spending a single life wholesale. The air tightens, then loosens. An oath inside the watcher bends toward an older kindness. It was forbidden to name. When passage is granted, it is not triumph, but allowance. 6 inches of space in which a future can pass. The signpost creaks as if it understands the math. Behind them, the city inhales. Ahead, the forest draws a wet breath that smells of iron and evergreen. The forest begins where law forgets its voice. Trees lean close enough to conspire. The path knots itself, and then pretends it never did. Storm becomes teacher. It pairs the journey to pace, to breath, to the stubborn arithmetic of staying upright. The shrine does not approach so much as agree to be found, its stones slick with centuries, its spiral eaten thin by moss and frost. Pain graduates from whisper to counsel. Each throb is a metronome keeping the vow in time. They move by the old disciplines, count steps, name landmarks, share water. Speak out loud, so memory cannot rewrite direction. When the ground finally levels, silence grows architecture around a clearing, and in the center sits the altar that brokered a first breath and every rescue after. The body that has been ledger and lamp stands at the edge of the old story, and knows it is almost time to let the wick go out. Elsewhere, the city invents hands. Kettles hiss like geese, windows open to teach air the right paths, and grief learns to be useful without becoming a factory. The teacher who stayed becomes a conductor, drawing music from the clatter of basins and the discipline of soap. The wounded boy learns how to measure breaths, not with panic, but with count. How to hold still without surrendering. Rumor tries to break the door. Instruction secures it with hinges made of rhythm. In the clearing, thunder steps away to listen. The altar breathes the slow breath of stone, and a future assembles like a bridge in fog, plank by plank, belief by practice. The path behind has not disappeared. It has simply been absorbed. The path ahead is not lit. It is made by walking. When the lantern is set on the shrine, the storm's percussion softens into silence. Not a promise, only a permission. The sum waits for the missing first number. The clearing held a hush that did not belong to weather. A pause like the space a name makes before it is spoken. The altar waited, moss bright as new bruises, spiral thin as a vein under skin. Breath, misted and dispersed, a rehearsal for what must be done. She had carried so many endings in her hands that beginning felt strange, like walking downhill after months of climbing. The vow made in the palace uncoiled into action. Not to become a holy wound, not to let the city drown in return debts, but to loosen the knot where the story first cinched tight. No audience, only the forest and one steady presence who had learned the grammar of staying. She remembered an older night, a panic-swaddled bargain, a small body stolen back from the dark and taught to shine. The world narrowed to pulse, stone, rain. When she drew air and let it find its own way out, the altar seemed to lean closer, listening like a door. Words were unnecessary, but she spoke them anyway, not to persuade the stone or the listening dark, but to remind bone and blood that choice had a language. She named nothing grand, only exact things. The first borrowed breath, the households that had learned to boil water like a prayer, the child who slept without coughing because of hands that were not hers. She confessed to the hunger to be needed and the quiet terror of being ordinary. The forest did not flinch. The ache under her skin rose like a tide called home. Beside her, trust held shape and temperature. She placed one palm upon the spiral and found a coolness that felt older than loss. The breath she drew came steady and deep. The breath she returned left without drama, like a tide sliding off stones. Something eased. Not light, not thunder. More like a clasp opening. When the night exhaled, it seemed the story did too. The change did not arrive from above. It arrived within. Silver brightened once, a final flare like frost catching dawn, then unraveled into paleness threaded through skin, a memory rather than a sentence. Weakness scrolled its warning and then gentled into weariness. In the same breath, distance rethreaded. Far away, a city shifted on its axis. Windows banged open to air that smelled less like fear. Kettles hissed in relief rather than alarm. The bell in the square sounded ordinary, and the ordinariness was beautiful. She staggered and did not fall. A hand found hers, not to save her from gravity, but to return her to it. The altar felt lighter, as if a hidden weight had been lifted from stone. No choir, no blaze. A silence came true, and in that silence, Space for the work that begins after miracles end. She stood in it until it fit, like breaking in a new name. Morning climbed the trees as if uncertain it was welcome. The path back felt shorter, the way return often does when an answer rides in muscle instead of in hope. At the city edge, the air wore a different grammar. Coughing had lost its edge. The market's murmur reassembled. Grief, still present, no longer kept time for everyone. In the palace, a nursery learned the sound of unremarkable sleep. The woman who ruled set down a fear she had been holding like a blade and found her hands empty and shaking. In the apothecary lane, instruction continued, not because a miracle had failed, but because it had succeeded in refusing itself. She walked through streets that knew her name and felt them loosen their grip, not in rejection but in relief. The world did not bow. It made room. That felt holier than praise. Later, in rooms that smelled of rosemary and ink, a new craft began. She catalogued herbs, ground bark, labeled jars in a hand that shook only at first. The work multiplied by moving outward. 2 pupils became 4, then 8. Instructions grew into routines. Routines into habits that did not need her presence to persist. She felt the absence of the old brightness like a phantom limb and did not mistake the ache for a regret. The companion who had walked beside her found that staying was not an oath, but a daily practice, as specific as sharp knives and boiled water. The queen opened the palace gate and her ledger's boat. The watcher at the crossroads stood a little less rigid. In the evenings, the city learned a new lullaby. The sound of many small, ordinary mercies performed well. When night gathered, she went to the doorway and let it pass without asking it to become anything else.